In Module 4, we're going to talk about the writings. And as a whole, the writings are books of the Bible that are scattered throughout the Old Testament, but their dates typically coincide with the time after the exile. If you remember, I said that during the times of the prophets, the Babylonians came into Jerusalem in 597 BCE. Then they destroyed Jerusalem in 587 BCE. And at that point, the Israelites went into exile in Babylon. And then Ezekiel preached to the Israelites in exile, and then they came back. And then there were a few prophets after the exile. For instance, we talked about Haggai and Malachi. Well, the writings depict the time frame after the exile. Israel is under Persian rule. There's no more king except for the king of Persia. And in Jerusalem, there is the remnant, the people left over. So this is what's happening during the time of the writings. Now, in terms of the books, they're all over the place, like I said. So there's a few historical books, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. There are poems. We're going to look at the Psalms. But we also have Lamentations and the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, as sometimes it's called. Wisdom literature, Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, and we're going to talk about Ecclesiastes. Short stories, which we'll look at both of these, Esther and Ruth, and then Apocalypse, which would be the book of Daniel. So these are some of the books, and as I said, they're scattered throughout the Old Testament. Now, the writings, they're historical circumstances. We've seen a little bit of this already. So there's no king. The priests are the dominant ruling group. And if you remember, the book of Malachi talks a lot about the priests and their corruption. There are diverse groups of Jews already during the times of the writings. So we already have the Samaritans, the Judeans, the diaspora, which are the Jews who have been scattered throughout the land. And these are folks that are mentioned in the New Testament. So they already exist here in the times of the writings. There are various ideas about who the true Israelites are. So who are the godly? Sometimes they are depicted as the people who returned from the exile. Sometimes they are depicted as the people who stayed in Jerusalem during the exile. Sometimes they're depicted as, people from other nations who've converted to the Israelite religion. So there's a wide understanding of the true faithful people. The writings challenge inherited theological traditions. So we're going to look at a few of these that actually try to address notions of theodicy. They try to address the blessings and the curses and try to figure out what's going on with that, and is it really as strict as it appears to be in Deuteronomy. So we'll look at a few of those theological challenges. I already said that Judea was a small Persian territory, so Persia is now the ruling the ruling empire. But the nice thing about Persia is that Persia is really religiously tolerant. And so, whereas the Babylonians wanted to wipe out the Israelites and wipe out Israelite religion to the point of stealing the artifacts from the temple, Persia actually encourages the remnant to rebuild the temple and to follow their faith and to worship God. What we also see in the writings is a priestly background, in part because, of course, the priests are in charge. So this is kind of a timeline of how this happened with some corresponding books. So what we know about this history, of course, we get from the Bible. The initial returnees come back to Jerusalem in 538 after the Persians defeated the Babylonians. They try to rebuild the temple, but of course they abandon the project. And the book of Ezra really tells us that it's because of some interference on the part of some of the Persians, not all of them. The king actually wanted the people to rebuild the temple, but the neighboring folks didn't want it to happen. Then later on in 522, there are more exiles led by Zerubbabel and Joshua who come in, and then they finish the temple under Haggai's expert witness there. So we talked about the book of Haggai and how he encouraged the people to rebuild the temple. So about 70 years later, Ezra, who was a priest, led a group to reestablish the Torah as the authority for Jews in Judah. And we see in the book of Ezra where Ezra stands up in front of the whole crowd of Israelites and reads the Torah. And much like King Josiah, who established some religious reforms, Ezra now is kind of taking the lead and saying, you know what, we have this Torah, we need to follow it, we need to follow it pretty strictly in order to not go back into exile again. And so we see Ezra reading the Torah in front of the Jews. And now we actually have Jews too. They're not really called Israelites anymore. They're certainly not called Hebrews anymore. But these are now Jews. Then 10 years later, Nehemiah leads a group to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and repopulate the city. So by the time we get to the end of Nehemiah, Jerusalem has been rebuilt, and it is populated now with Jews, and those Jews are working on reestablishing their faith and rebuilding their faith and their trust in God. Some of the theological concerns were two big ones. Theodicy, of course, is one of the main problems in the Bible as a whole, I would think. But we definitely find that in the writings, particularly in the book of Job. The remnant of people who came back to Jerusalem kind of believed that they were doomed, no matter what happened. That even if they were trying to worship God, they weren't doing it the right way, and God was angry, and they couldn't help themselves. So they questioned God's motives. And the motives seem to be a direct contrast to their acceptance of the blessings and curses. In other words, the people in Deuteronomy accepted these terms. If you worship God, you'll live long in the land. If you fail to worship God, you'll get kicked out of the land. But after the exile, after God had promised that he would rebuild Jerusalem and, rebuild the people and open their hearts and a new covenant, and they'd heard all these words from the prophets, they'd heard all these promises, but now they were having trouble understanding what exactly it was that they were doing wrong. So they questioned God. And they really did think that God had abandoned them, and that the evil was seeping into the world. We also have a question of monotheism. And monotheism, of course, is the worship of one God. And that ties directly into theodicy. So most of these nations had their own gods, or set of gods, or one god. Most of them had sets of gods. And it seems that whichever nation won, that set of gods was viewed as the most powerful. Well, one of the problems with theodicy, of believing in one God, that the Israelites also experienced, is that you have to assign both good and bad to that God. And that was really hard for them to do, even though, of course, if you read back through the other books of the Bible, you can see that God delivers both, negative consequences and positive consequences of Israel's behavior. And so the writings address the notion that God, who is all good, can allow evil to happen in the world. And as we see in the book of Job and even in the Psalms, there's a variety of responses to that particular question. So now I want to run through the Psalms really quickly. There's really no way to run through these really quickly, but I'm going to try to give you a basic overview of the Psalms. So there are 150 Psalms, although number 14 and number 53 are the same. They're written over many centuries, but approximately 73 of them are attributed to David, which, if you can do the math, that's almost half. Half of the Psalms attributed to King David. These Psalms are songs that are used in Israel's worship. So they have some liturgical uses. They explain, or maybe not explain, but they express Israel's emotions towards God. And so we see in the Psalms both praise and worship and lament and anger and fear and joy. All of it is expressed in the Psalms. The Psalms are also poetry. So we see different poetry conventions in the Psalms. Parallelism, we see quite a bit in parallelism. Parallelism is the idea that these two lines of poetry are related to each other. And so, for instance, if we look at Psalm 119, verses 1 through 3, happy are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. So you can hear the first line, happy are those whose way is blameless. And then the second line, who walk in the law of the Lord, further describes those whose way is blameless. That's parallelism. Acrostic, we know what acrostic is because we all did it, in 6th grade. We wrote our names downward, and then we used each letter of our name the letters of our name to come up with a word that described us. Okay? Well, acrostic poems, each verse starts with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And so you can't see it in English, but it's definitely there in Hebrew. And there are only 22 letters of the alphabet in Hebrew. So, for instance, Psalms 9 and 10, that's one acrostic psalm. And so, even though you can't see it in English, each verse starts with a consecutive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Metaphors and similes, we certainly know what they are, and we will talk about those as we go a little bit further. Some of the common themes in the Psalms are trust. We see that all over the place. Even if the Israelites are angry at God, they trust that God can deliver them from distress. The theme of God is king. We see that all over the Psalms, that God is the heavenly king, that God sent his son to be the earthly king, that God is reigning up somewhere in heaven, ready to help the Israelites with whatever's going on in their lives. And that's all different things that we'll discuss here in a minute. The human king is God's son, and we see that in several of the Psalms. Usually that refers to David. Occasionally it refers to Solomon. But the notion, of course, is that God chose this person to be king, and that king is full of righteousness and goodness and justice.